Once a week, from his council flat in North London, this man rings for news of his father, a political prisoner, jailed for campaigning for peace and a nominee for this year's Nobel Peace Prize. The words used are carefully chosen. At the other end, the phones are tapped. But this call is not to Poland or to Russia. It is to Turkey, a member of the Western Alliance and part of the free world. This summer, the tourists gazing at Santa Sofia, the glory of Istanbul's heritage, will have been unaware that just 50 yards away is a military prison. Filming in secret, Brass Tacks spoke to a woman whose son had been detained there. For talking to us, she herself risks a minimum jail sentence of 5 years.
They tortured my child. He stayed in the police station for 25 days and they tortured him a lot. They beat him on his feet. They gave him electric shocks and they gouged out some of his flesh. They gave him electric shocks on his feet and they hung him up by his arms.
In prisons like this, at least 20,000 political prisoners are held. Most of them are said to have been subjected to torture. Some are violent revolutionaries, but others include trade unionists, lawyers and peace activists. They are guarded by soldiers who, as part of NATO, receive the support of Britain. Ever since the army seized power 4 years ago, Turkey has tried to convince the West that human rights are respected. This year, they've been welcomed back into the councils of the free world. The question is, was it too soon? Lost amongst the lunchtime shoppers on the Seven Sisters Road in North London, Mehmet Ali Dikerdem looks every bit the urbane academic. But the lecture room now takes second place to the full-time job of trying to free his father from prison, a 68-year-old man suffering from cancer. Mahmut Dikerdem was a career diplomat, an ambassador of Turkey for 20 years, a pillar of the establishment. 7 years ago, he founded the Turkish Peace Association. In 1980, the military took over in Turkey, and overnight, the association was banned. Mehmet Ali last saw his father 3 years ago.
In fact, on his last night, he was sitting in that very chair. I said to him, look, why don't you stay in London until this trouble blows away? Why don't you just take it easy, stay here? Because the doctors had suggested to him that what he needed, above all, was rest. Not to be involved in anything, to rest and recuperate and have himself looked after. And he turned to me and he said, I can tell you've been abroad for too long. I can tell you've lost touch with Turkey. Because if they touch the likes of us, know that the end in Turkey has come. Know that there's no law and order left in Turkey. They couldn't possibly touch us. They wouldn't dare. And I, in fact, thought about that, and he left. 4 months later, he was picked up in a dawn raid and incarcerated.
The Peace Association was utterly respectable. Its founders included the president of the Turkish Medical Association, the president of the Istanbul Bar Association, and 400 other intellectuals. It had contacts with peace movements in both East and West, and though it questioned belonging to NATO, it was multi, not unilateral, hardly subversive. In June 1982, the trial began under full martial law in a converted basketball court. Mahmut Dikerdem and his colleagues were charged under Article 141 of the Turkish Penal Code. The association had been legal. Now, in retrospect, it was illegal. The charge was of challenging the established order of the state. On November the 14th last year, after sitting for 20 months, the court finally reached its verdict.
And on that day, they all went there, and most of them were expecting to be released. Most of them were optimists, because there was absolutely no legal grounds on which they could have been done, as it were. And they were chatting away quite merrily with a French Socialist Party member of Parliament, Monsieur Jean-Pierre Fauré. They held a seminar, as it were, on the French foreign policy, etc. Then at 4 o'clock, 4:30, after about a 10-hour session, when the court had adjourned, the military tribunal came back, and unbeknownst to them, behind the scenes, soldiers were getting ready with yards and yards of chains in their hands. And almost immediately after the verdict was read, and it was the most awful verdict which would have come out at the time, prison sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years, to be followed by incredibly long periods of internal exile in far-flung places of Turkey. The soldiers moved in. At Metris prison, military prison complex, what happens is that you get chains wrapped around you. So my father apparently turned and said, gentlemen, Mrs. Isvan, allow me my last prerogative as your president, and stepped first to be chained and manacled and taken to these horrible little cars, to be taken 300 yards down the road and to be put in a prison which was about 20 square meters, on which 18 people were dumped.
Nicholas Blake, an English barrister, flew out to observe the trial for the European nuclear disarmament campaign. Would British or Western European lawyers understand the crimes of which the Peace Association people are accused as crimes?
No, I think not. At very best, it could be said that this is what's called constructive sedition. It's a doctrine which went out of fashion in Europe, and certainly in England, with the failed prosecution of Tom Paine in around 1780, 1790, and I don't think anyone's really tried to take it seriously in England ever since then.
So what in effect are they accused of?
The Peace Association trial is really a trial for a person's organising around a set of ideas. It's a trial directly concerned with the freedom of expression. It's a set of views which the military do not like. They therefore say, since we do not like them, that's dangerous for Turkey to have, therefore we're going to ban you and prosecute you. The
details of what has happened to Mahmut Dikerdem since he was sentenced are known largely through a letter smuggled out from prison earlier this year.
A particularly nasty officer known as the Harpoon arrives one day and starts knocking on the cell wall and says, "Mahmut," my father's first name, "get ready, get ready." And my father says yes, because he was expecting at that time to be transferred to hospital to receive treatment for cancer. So he gets ready, he embraces with his friends and moves out. Outside, the Harpoon. He's so called, he's called the Harpoon because he had a spear-like thing in his hand with which he used to poke people, including the Turkish Peace Association people. And outside, the Harpoon says, "Strip search." Apparently my father says, "No. You can search me, but not a strip search, because a strip search involves the horrible and undignified act of being stark naked, bending down, and having your anus poked and searched as well." And my father said, "No." The Harpoon said, apparently, "Look, it'll be bad for you." Threatening, real abuse and threatening. And then apparently my father said, "Okay, apply the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War to me. I refuse to be strip searched." So apparently the man, this Harpoon character, was a bit scrambled, and he walked away. He came back, and he said, "Okay, right, we'll take you without strip searching you." And all the people witnessing this, hearing this, they couldn't actually see what was happening, thought, human dignity has won. Great, Dikerdem has finally started something new at Metris military prison, one of the most notorious military prisons, and the records of the things which have happened at Metris overflows the records of Amnesty International. But again, little did my father know. Apparently he was chained around his neck, through his arms, everywhere, put in this metal boxcar, which is typical of Metris prison, and taken for a ride round Istanbul. Just a ride round Istanbul for a couple of hours.
Suffering from cancer.
Suffering from cancer, and he has to go, because it's the cancer of the prostate, he has to go to toilets once every 2 hours or so. Needless to say, the journey lasted for longer than 2 hours. Inside this box van, this prison van, first of all, there's no light, there was absolutely nothing. It was completely pitch dark, freezing. The chains around his neck and arms started biting into his flesh, and he was being tossed and turned around, bumped around through every corner and every bump on the roads. And he was taken to another part of Istanbul, to a military complex, and the excuse which was given to him was all a mistake. And they sent him back to prison that night with lacerations on his wrists and a man absolutely enraged, 68-year-old man, suffering from cancer, receiving this kind of treatment. And I believe that the people responsible for that treatment are no different from Gestapo officers.
When the military regime took over, the peace movement wasn't their only target. They also banned one of Turkey's 2 trade union federations. It was called DİSK. Before the coup, it had been a perfectly legal organisation with 500,000 members. Now, 586 of its senior officials are on trial, with more added weekly. The prosecution is asking for the death sentence in 76 cases. The International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, the organisation that led the campaign supporting solidarity in Poland and which represents most trade unions in the free world, is deeply concerned about the fate of DİSK. Peter De Jonge has been their official observer throughout the trial.
The presiding judge, and there are 3 judges, and they're all, since it's a martial law court, they're all military people, military lawyers. It is run almost in a dictatorial manner by the presiding judge. He decides practically on everything in the courtroom. He also does the interrogation of the witnesses, and he dictates back, not the words of the witnesses themselves are taken down, but what the judge, the presiding judge, makes of it, and that is taken down verbatim. Every now and again, the lawyers try to intervene, to make either a point of law or to make an interjection, as lawyers do. Most often they're slapped down by the presiding judge.
It sounds like a rather odd form of justice.
Well, according to us, as ICFTU, it is not justice, and that's why we have called for a stop to the trial.
Abdullah Bastürk, the president of DİSK and a former MP, has spent 4 years in jail. This is what he told the court of his treatment under interrogation.
I retract this statement because I was interrogated under torture. These confessions were written by the interrogators themselves. I was forced to sign them blindfold. For 6 days and nights, they made me sit, blindfolded and tied to an iron chair. They hit my head and temples for 10 minutes at a time, and I was continuously insulted and threatened. I couldn't sleep for 6 days and 6 nights. I was punched, slapped, and hit in the face. That is why I retract these 3 statements, because they were not written of my own free will.
When you read Abdullah Bastürk's account of how he'd been tortured, how did you feel?
Well, first place, it shocked us that such a thing is possible in a country like Turkey. Bastürk himself had the courage to protest to the judge, to make an official complaint to the judge. But that particular complaint, though normally according to procedure should be investigated and should be in his official file, disappeared and no action was taken at all. One can say similarly of other defendants of DİSK who have also been tortured but did not make a special deposition like Bastürk did. I would say that most of the DİSK defendants at the interrogation stage were maltreated, not to say tortured.
That's a very serious allegation.
It is a very serious allegation, but it is, one has to face the truth. It is the truth. We have it from their own mouths, from the horse's mouth, you might say. At one time, we met the prisoners in the prison, and it was confirmed to us then that they had been maltreated.
Is it possible to make any comparison between what's going on in Turkey now and what has been going on in Eastern Europe with free trade unions?
Oh, yes, I would say that quite clearly in both countries the aim is to suppress free trade unions. Free trade unions as pillars of democracy.
When people like Abdullah Bastürk and Mahmut Dikerdem are locked up for their beliefs by a foreign government, public opinion here doesn't usually make much difference. But in this case, what Britain thinks does matter, because Turkey is bound up with the West, both as a crucial ally in NATO and as a partner in Europe. We're on the same side, we share the same treaty obligations, we observe the same conventions. For 500 years, Turkey has been the bridge between Europe and Asia, an Oriental Islamic society with a foothold in the Christian West. As the once glorious Ottoman Empire declined miserably into the sick man of Europe, that foothold shrunk to the borders that exist today. But the sights and sounds of modern Turkey are European, and that is thanks entirely to one man. His plan was to transform a corrupt Oriental Empire into a Western democratic republic. Kemal Atatürk, literally the father of all Turks, is the strongest symbol of Turkey's decision to turn to the West. Atatürk detached the worship of Islam from the state and decreed that Turks should dress in Western clothing. And to set an example, he presented his own wife in public without the veil. Since Atatürk's death in 1938, the ties binding Turkey to the West have grown stronger and stronger. In 1948, Turkey joined the Council of Europe. In 1963, she became an associate member of the Common Market. And crucially, back in 1952, at the height of the Cold War, Turkey had joined NATO. Turkey has always been important to the alliance. In a war, control of the Bosphorus would stop Russian ships from sailing into the Mediterranean, and as many as 20 Warsaw Pact divisions could be held down on the Russian border. But in the past 5 years, Turkey has become quite crucial. The invasion of Afghanistan, chaos in Iran, and the Gulf War have left the Turks as the only line of defence on NATO's southern flank. The army inherited from Atatürk is 500,000 strong. Its influence is felt in almost every part of Turkish life. It sees itself as the guardian of the Republic. Twice it has seized power from democratically elected governments, and twice withdrawn dutifully back to barracks. By the 1970s, Turkey was on the verge of civil war. It was a battleground for terrorists of the left and the right. The carnage was appalling. 200 violent deaths a month by the end. Ordinary Turks caught in the crossfire felt the state had lost control. So when, in 1980, the army once again stepped in to restore order, there was a tremendous sense of relief. But this time, under General Kenan Evren, there has been no return to barracks, and the clampdown has gone beyond the terrorists. After the coup, more than 30,000 suspects were rounded up and put in jail. In the wake of horrific violence, it was perhaps an understandable reaction. But 4 years on, at least 20,000 are still behind bars, defendants in long drawn-out political trials. In London, those who've managed to escape enjoy the official status of political refugee. They're the lucky ones who broke bail and got out on a forged passport. Sema Uğur and Nursal Yılmaz, a secretary and a primary school teacher, enjoying the banal freedom of a London street, two of the latest crop of refugees. They can now talk freely about the treatment given to political prisoners. They'd been charged not with crimes of violence, but with belonging to a Marxist organisation, one that had been banned even before the coup, but not persecuted. They were arrested and detained at Dal police headquarters in Ankara.
The torture rooms at Dal were designed as bathrooms. We were taken there blindfolded to prevent us seeing anyone. First, they'd put me on a table and tied my arms with straps. After a while, they pulled a chair out from under me. My arms were left tied from my wrists to the central heating pipes. I was in terrible pain. They put me on a chair. Then they raised my arms up, and they tied my wrists with straps to a water pipe in the ceiling. They tied it so that I was hanging by both arms. And they pulled the chair from under me. I stayed like this for a long time. At first, your arms support you, but after a while, your arms can't support you. You start feeling a terrible pain. Not satisfied with this, they swing your body back and forth. They swear, laugh at you. They tell you that they'll never let you come down, that your arms will drop off, that you'll die if you do not admit to certain crimes.
İki kez girdiğimde de elektrik şok verildi.
I was given electric shocks on 2 occasions.
Arkamdaki radyatöre...
Once I was tied to a radiator from behind, and they applied electricity to my fingers.
Bir keresinde de...
Another time, the policeman gave me electric shocks right here, on my genitals. They wet my genitals and said, "Speak. If you don't talk, we will sterilize you. We will keep giving you the electric shocks."
Once I was taken to the torture room. I thought that I was going to be tortured, but they opened my blindfold and all the policemen stood behind me. They didn't want to show their faces. They told me to look in front of me. When I looked, I saw my fiancé. He was suspended from the wall. They had suspended him on the wall. His head was behind his arms. As a matter of fact, the way he was hanging, his body should have been straight, but I think because of the pain, his body was arched. His trousers were undone. I realized that they'd given him electricity on his penis before I was taken there. I found this out later from my fiancé, that he had had electric shocks on his genitals many times, and he was passing blood in his urine. They said to me, "Tell your fiancé to admit everything and we'll let him down." They were forcing me to make him talk. That was more painful for me than my own torture. I think you feel more pain from the screams of someone you love. It was very painful for me. They did this to me and my fiancé several times. All these methods of torture were not only carried out on me and my husband. On the first occasion I was there were about 200 people. The second time, about 100. All were undergoing torture. When they took me from the torture room to the cell, or when I was made to wait in the corridor, there were always other people being taken into the torture rooms. In fact, it was quite ridiculous. There were not enough torture rooms for their needs, so the tortures were carried out outside as well. In the toilets, the cells, everywhere.
The Turkish government has said very specifically that neither you nor Sema nor your lawyers actually complained about torture at the time of your trial.
I told the court about the tortures in prison. The court did not want to know. They said they could only deal with the case against me and had no authority over what happened to me at Dal or in the prison. This did not interest them. But they were trying me on the basis of the evidence I had given under torture at these places. They were happy to try me on that evidence, but they could not care less what I went through there.
Sema and Nursal escaped while on bail. In their absence, they have both been sentenced to 6 years in prison. An independent medical examination commissioned by Brass Tacks confirms their injuries. In Turkey, 102 security personnel have been convicted of torturing prisoners, but the government denies that torture is systematic or widespread. However, this year, 2 reports documenting evidence of extensive torture in Turkey have been published. Helsinki Watch, the leading American human rights organisation, reported that torture continued unchecked, indicating either that the government cannot control its own military and police, or, more likely, that the martial law high command is still perceived as tolerating or encouraging the use of torture. Amnesty International, who've long reported on torture in Turkey, opened their latest campaign with this file.
Amnesty International thinks that torture in Turkey is very widespread. It happens in police stations and prisons throughout Turkey. We also think that it is, without doubt, systematic. We are aware that the Turkish authorities admit to isolated incidents of torture, but all the information we've had over a long period of time makes us convinced that it is systematic.
Now, you had reports of torture before the military coup. What's changed since?
The allegations became much more numerous after the coup. There were many more people being detained, and one had the impression that the pressures to get confessions were greater, and for this reason, certainly one had an impression of greatly increased torture and perhaps an increase in the severity of torture.
The people who seem to have been the victims of the worst excesses in Turkish prisons are the Kurdish minority. Hüseyin Yıldırım is a lawyer from Diyarbakir in eastern Turkey. 3 years ago, he took on the defence of Kurdish separatists in a mass trial. Some 4,000 Kurds faced charges in the course of the trial. Most said they had been tortured. After a year, pressure was put on Yıldırım to relinquish the case. Eventually, he was himself arrested and detained.
When I entered the dungeon, there were about 40 to 50 people. A torture team of 40 to 50 people with torture clubs in their hands surrounded me. They took me to a large hall. They made me strip naked. Then first they punched me a lot on my stomach and my jaw. Then there was this sewage flowing into the hall, put there deliberately. They put me face downwards into this sewage. They pulled me by my arms, and a number of the torturers were meanwhile hitting me on the back. Then when I looked around for a moment, there was blood all round. They were hitting so hard that I hadn't been able to open my eyes. Then they gave me falaka, the beating on the soles of the feet. They hit my arms and hands. They wrapped something fire-resistant round my head. Before they wrapped this round me, a flame shot up. Then I realized I was in the fire. My back was burning. Every time I got out of the circle of flames, they beat me back into it, beating me on my back. Then they pushed me forward like a wheelbarrow, holding my legs. Then my head was stuck in a clamp by the neck, and they hit me very hard on the back. I was badly beaten on the back. I felt a fierce pain over my left kidney. Later, when I put my hand there, I realized there was an open wound in that place. My fingers went right into the wound. Then they broke my jaw. He came and told me to open my mouth. He had something hard in his hand. He struck my jaw with it from below. My jaw was split. Most of my teeth were broken. In the end, I had none left. The roots of my teeth became inflamed. He used to put one end of the torture club on my shoulder, the other end in my mouth. Manipulating the stick like this, he would split the gums and the roots came out.
Official Turkish accounts of deaths through torture since the coup have not been consistent. In March 1982, the government said that 15 people had died as a result of torture. In October 1982, they said that only 4 had died. In April this year, the figure for the same period had changed again. This time, they said that only 2 had died. The price of order in the coup was the abolition of parliament, the suppression of free trade unions, the banning of free speech, and the escalation of routine torture, for all of which, in 1980, Turkey's credentials as a democratic European state were effectively suspended. 2 years on, a kind of phony democracy returned. A referendum gave General Evren the presidency. 1 year later, he called an election. But of the 15 parties that wanted to run, only 3 met the general's approval, and half of their candidates were not allowed to stand. The Council of Europe said, "The parliament that will be elected in Turkey on the 6th of November cannot be considered as representing the Turkish people in a democratic manner." Now, that judgment mattered to the Turks because the Council of Europe, which is based here in Strasbourg, sets the standards for European democracy. It is, if you like, the conscience of European democracy, and every democratic Western European nation belongs. Without the Council's approval, Turkey was very much out in the cold. She needed badly to get back in, to stand any chance of picking up £400 million worth of common market aid that had been suspended after the coup. So, from this point on, it was vital for the Turkish government to prove to Western Europe, firstly, that they were bringing torture under control, and secondly, that they were back on the road to real democracy. This January, just 2 months after the elections, a team of senior Turkish diplomats flew to Lanzarote in the Canary Islands to lobby an influential committee of the Council of Europe. It didn't work. The Turks were firmly asked not to send their politicians to Strasbourg. It was an instruction that the regime simply ignored. 24 Turkish MPs duly turned up inside this chamber, and when they came here, they were accompanied by senior members of the Turkish Foreign Ministry. By far their strongest support came from the British Conservatives. In the debate that followed, the exchanges were, to say the very least, heated, and in the end, the session just broke down in complete confusion. Tory MP Sir Frederick Bennett, who has had a long association with Turkey and its people, lobbied hard for the Turks to be readmitted.
Many Turks said to me, after the elections where the question of their re-entry arose into the Assembly, if we are not fit to be your friends and colleagues politically, socially, and every other way, if you don't think we're fit to be members of the European family, then we see no reason to remain in NATO and merely be your mercenaries. Either we're fit to be your friends or we're not, but you can't just pick and choose the thing that suits us, which is that we've got a large army which would be very helpful in a war against the Soviet Union, but we're not fit to mix with you politically.
In March, the Turkish government allowed local elections to take place, with 3 more parties permitted to stand. In late April, more shuttle diplomacy. A group of senior diplomats and MPs toured the capitals of Western Europe, just to repeat the message that Turkey was back on the road to democracy. Meanwhile, the Council of Europe sent a delegation to Turkey, led by Danish Liberal Bjorn Elmquist. The idea was to inspect prison conditions. They wanted particularly to see the 3 prisons where torture and ill treatment had been most closely documented. They were refused admittance until they threatened to abandon the visit.
Our tour was guided. Just like when you visit Copenhagen, for instance, you will have a guided tour through the city, and the people who guide you show you what they think will give you the best impression of the city as a tourist. Now, when we visited the prison, I think they showed us through it to show us facilities, rooms, where we could see that prisoners were not maltreated.
David Barchard has been working in Turkey as a journalist for 4 years. He has seen a succession of such delegations.
In general, I think the style is what one might call repressive hospitality. These people are given a red carpet treatment, they're treated as VIPs, they're hardly given a moment to themselves, let alone a moment to think, either by their embassies or by the Turkish Foreign Ministry, and they go home with enormous debts of hospitality, and it would probably seem churlish for them to inquire too deeply into the nasty side of what's going on here.
Back in Strasbourg, the Council of Europe met again. Based on Mr. Elmquist's inconclusive report and the appearance of democracy, the MPs of Western Europe finally voted to let Turkey back in. The Turkish government was delighted. Their official news sheet described Mr. Elmquist's guided tour as a freely conducted survey, which had proved to the Council of Europe that the charges of human rights violations had been unfounded. How do you feel about the Turkish government saying that?
I don't like it, of course, and I don't think it should be done this way. But I must, on the other hand, also regrettably say it's my impression this is not the first time it's happening. It's clear for me that parts of the Turkish authorities are using, people are using names for propaganda.
It was only later that Mr. Elmquist found out that what he hadn't seen were the cramped cells at the back of Diyarbakir, where Hüseyin Yıldırım, the Kurdish lawyer, had been held. What he'd been shown was the administration block. You feel you were duped a little bit?
After the information I received afterwards, I think I was duped, yes.
But supporters of Turkey's readmission, like Sir Frederick Bennett, have had no second thoughts. Do you feel there's any real evidence that the human rights record of the Turkish government has improved in the last 12 months?
I'm very sure it has, and perhaps the best argument in favour of human rights, I suppose most people would think that the most basic human right is to remain alive, and I don't know whether you have mentioned or will mention in the course of any of your series the fact that no less than 6,000 people were killed in the 3 years preceding the generals taking over by terrorists from right and left, and they didn't have many human rights when they were being murdered.
I have spoken to people in Turkey who have been tortured. They say that torture has got worse, is continuing, and is more systematic.
Well, all I can say is that is not the findings of the Council of Europe committee that have been and who eventually voted in a clear vote, as I've made it clear.
The leader of that committee, the leader of the delegation who went to Turkey and saw Diyarbakir prison, now says he was duped.
Well, as a matter of fact, it's only yesterday that I saw him, and I'm not so sure that you are correct in what you say.
Well, he told me in an interview he was duped.
Well, he may have said he was duped, but in any sense, certainly I could quote you names of other members of Parliament who went on that delegation who said they were not duped.
Can I ask you, did you believe it was right to support solidarity in Poland?
Of course I believed it was right to support solidarity in Poland.
Then why is it not right to support free trade unions in Turkey?
Well, for the very good reason they are in fact trade unions in Turkey at the present time. They're not as free as they are in some other countries. But in the case of Poland...
DİSK isn't free. DİSK has been suppressed.
The case of Poland, which you're trying to bring in, which is a totally false analysis, the situation in Turkey
Not according to the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions.
I'm allowed to express my opinion as well as you yours. I'm saying that the situation in Poland was that 20 people a day were not being, in fact, shot by terrorists, in which members of an organisation could or could not have been involved. Solidarity was not involved in acts of terrorism, and I've never supported acts of terrorism wherever they take
Where
place.
is the evidence
so the
that
comparison
DİSK
is ridiculous, if I may say so.
Where is the evidence that DİSK was involved in acts of terrorism?
Well, the evidence is before the court and will be judged by a court.
Well, they haven't produced it.
Well, that's what you keep on saying yourself, what they haven't produced. I say, in fact, that the case is under consideration by the courts, and in the end, the courts will pronounce a verdict, and I'm not prepared to anticipate what that verdict will be, nor am I prepared to comment on evidence before a case which is sub judice.
The best way to find out if the Turkish government's record on prison conditions and human rights has improved was to visit Turkey itself. Because television crews are strictly controlled and monitored, we went as tourists, using a home video camera. Martial law is still very much in force in the main cities. We were told that the phones were tapped, and our contacts insisted that we only used public coin boxes. We were taken in taxis to safe locations. The penalty faced by our interviewees for publicly criticising the state is a minimum jail sentence of 5 years. This group of women agreed to talk anonymously. Their sons and husbands have been held in the 2 main Istanbul prisons for 4 years, charged with involvement in terrorist activities. They told us that far from getting better, prison conditions had got worse in the past year.
It started about a year and a half ago. They took away all their paper and their books and their pencils. They were not allowed television or radio, and they started searching them in an inhuman way. They searched them at all hours of the day, even at midnight. All these things happened, as well as the torture and the beatings, and they now have no way of defending themselves properly in court.
I haven't seen my child for 9 months. I can't tell you how he is now because I haven't seen him. In any case, the soldiers don't let us near the gate. For a while, they would take in clean underwear to our sons, but now they don't even do that. We have no news at all, and for the last month, we have not even had a letter. No news at all. We have asked the administration, the captain, the soldiers, why don't you allow us to see them, we say. When we tell them we want to see our sons, the soldiers push us away with truncheons and call the police, and we can't protest anymore. We ask how our children are. They say they are all right, just go away. That's all.
In the prison, how much freedom to walk, to take exercise in the fresh air do your sons have?
Since there are no visits, our children have not been taken out for exercise. For about a year and a half, there's been no exercise in Metris prison. Even under normal conditions, there was very little exercise. They were allowed out perhaps once a week for half an hour. But now, in the last year, there's been no exercise at all.
In May, for placing an unauthorised wreath on behalf of their sons on this memorial to Kemal Ataturk, 11 mothers, along with the florist who sold them the wreath, were prosecuted. They now face trial. Some people say that democracy and human rights are returning to Turkey. Is that how you see it?
As people living in Turkey, we don't believe this is a country where there is democracy. We don't believe there are any real attempts to introduce democracy. Because if democracy gave people freedom, if it gave them freedom of thought, we would see this in the prisons, and this would be reflected in the conditions our relatives have to live under while in prison. Especially since the civilian government came to power in the last year, we believe that bad treatment in the prisons has increased. So much so that our relatives are losing their dignity. They are trying to take away their progressive views, their democratic views. If there was freedom of thought, there would be no repression in prisons. The day we can see our children again, then the situation will be better. Democracy will never take root in Turkey while prison conditions are as bad as this.
We discovered that in June of this year, people had been tortured not for their political beliefs, but their religious convictions. This is the account of one of a group of 30 Jehovah's Witnesses detained here at Dal Police Headquarters in Ankara.
In the evening, they took us one by one to another room for questioning, this time by some higher-ranking policemen. Eyes still blindfolded, one asked the questions, the other squeezed my testicles and punched me if they didn't like the answer I'd given. In the case of one of the other witnesses, who is an elder in the congregation, they made him open his legs wide apart and hit his testicles with an iron rod.
Because under martial law, all newspapers are heavily censored, even for the foreign press, normal journalistic work is difficult.
Well, the first problem, of course, is that it's very dangerous for Turks to communicate alarming information to the foreign press. There are laws against it. People could be prosecuted. They're therefore reluctant to come forward and very reluctant to be named. But beyond that, there has been a certain element of harassment of foreign correspondents here.
Have you had problems?
Yes, I have had problems on a number of occasions. I've had plainclothes policemen lurking outside my house in cars with crackling microphones. I've had strange telephone calls in the middle of the night. One's had indirect warnings from all sorts of people. And one, of course, also has the periodic indirect threat of deportation.
In May of this year, 1,200 of Turkey's leading lawyers, artists, doctors, academics and former politicians spoke out for the first time. In a petition submitted to the president, they called for the restoration of political freedom and the ending of torture and other violations of human rights. The continuance of torture, they said, was a crime against humanity. For their pains, 56 were arrested. One of those now facing trial agreed to talk to us. Yalçın Küçük, a former government economist who studied at Birmingham University, has in addition been imprisoned once and is still on trial for publishing a book criticising the economy. In the last 12 months, the Turkish government has said over and again that things are improving in the prisons, that there is very little torture anymore, and that democracy has now returned to Turkey. Your petition suggests that this is not correct.
Personally, I could answer this question. This is not my expression. This is not my experience. This is not my impression, because I was in prison when the election took place. I was out last January, and the things in prisons went further to the worse after not after the election, but since the last August, everything went to the worse instead of to the better.
What was the main purpose of the petition?
It is our right to do this. We think that this is our right to, because we are not allowed to write articles, we are not allowed to write books, we are not allowed to do anything else to form societies to express our views. There is only one way, that is you write a petition and all the I wouldn't say leading intellectuals come together, sign it, and we are very pleased that we have done it.
But in doing so, you have taken a risk.
You know, in countries like ours, you have to take risk. In order to fulfill your duty to your people, you always have to take risk. And we took the risk, and we are ready for any outcome it will bring to us.
We invited the Turkish ambassador in London to take part in this programme. He declined. The fact remains that Turkey's huge army and its many military bases are vital to NATO. But the question is, do considerations of defence mean that Turkey's welcome back into Europe should be endorsed by paying out the millions of pounds in common market aid that she wants?
Turkey is of particular interest to the West. We know of its importance to NATO. We know of its importance in the global strategy of general international politics. And because Turkey is eventually going to apply to join the European community, we want to make sure that human rights are respected in Turkey as much as they are in any other country within the European community. So we feel we owe a duty not only to Turkey and to the people of Turkey, but also to the European community as a whole.
So you're saying Turkey's not something that can be ignored?
Absolutely not.
There are those who say that, in the end, NATO defence commitments have a priority. They are more important than the question of individual human rights in any one country.
Well, if I may say so, I mean, I accept that you're reporting somebody else, but that is, of course, in theory nonsense, because NATO is defending exactly the human rights of all individuals in a free world. And if Turkey is going to remain in a free world, which, of course, we desperately hope she will, then she must learn to respect the human rights of individuals in her country, just as all we do in our country, try and defend the rights of people in our country. So it is a standard of justice, a standard of humanity that NATO is protecting. And it is therefore in Turkey's interest to protect those interests as well of her citizens.
The Common Market's £400 million aid package was frozen immediately the military took over. The British government quadrupled its own foreign aid to Turkey.
People in England reading about and hearing about what is happening in the prisons, torture, bad conditions and so forth, might say, well, this is all very distressing, but why should it matter to us? Why should it?
Well, first of all, it matters to some extent if it happens anywhere, because no man is an island, as Dunn said. But beyond that, I think one mustn't forget that Turkey has all sorts of umbilical links with Europe, both institutional and economic. It is, in many senses, a part of Europe, and it's guaranteed by exactly the same sorts of international treaties which guarantee democratic freedoms as those in Europe. So one's saying, basically, that the European Convention on Human Rights or the NATO Charter, all sorts of other agreements, don't matter. And one also has to look at the role of Western diplomats. If they're prepared to fudge on issues of human rights and freedoms here, then they could be doing the same thing in Italy, in France, or Germany, or even Britain itself tomorrow. If you're going to cover up issues of torture or political repression here today, then it could be happening in your own backyard tomorrow.
When we asked the Foreign Office for an interview, they declined. In a statement, they said, "We have made known to the Turkish authorities our concern about allegations of violations of human rights. Those